Hello and welcome to World Bank Live. I'm Paul Blake. Today we launch a new series of programs focused on the challenges and opportunities that countries face as they respond to and work to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. Let's be clear, many countries around the world are still actively responding to the crisis. But as they start to look out over the horizon and plan their recoveries, our programs will be convening key experts to offer ideas and actions that will allow them to build back with greater resilience, improved inclusivity, and strong economic growth. Today, we kick off this effort by looking at the challenge of maintaining food security amid the response and recovery. Our colleagues at the World Food Program estimate that the number of people who will face acute food insecurity could double by the end of the year. In large part, that's due to job losses and declining remittance flows. At the other end of the supply chain are farmers who face depressed prices for their unsold produce, a reduced ability to finance food production during the next growing season, and for those in East Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia, a massive locust crisis. The complexity of the food security challenge is matched only by the critical importance of responding to it. Over the next hour or so, to better understand this issue and how we should respond, we'll be joined by global, national, and local leaders, each of whom is on the forefront of the pandemic response and who will be sharing their experiences and ideas for action. And to get us started, I'm very happy to welcome World Bank Group President David Malpass to the program. David, it's really good to have you here, and I'm really grateful that you could join us to help us kick off this new series. I'm hoping you can help me set the scene a bit here. Can you help us understand and really give us a sense of what is happening with the world economy amidst the coronavirus pandemic, and tell us about your priorities and the World Bank Group's priorities when it comes to supporting a recovery?
It's a really difficult situation because of the global recession. We just put out our Global Economic Prospects report. It showed that the world economy may contract by 5.2% this year, which is really deep. In even a weak year, it normally grows at 1%. So this is a 5% contraction. Per capita income is going down in a lot of the developing countries, all of them pretty much, and the number of people in extreme poverty has gone up. We think by as many as 100 million people. Earlier estimates had been smaller, but it keeps growing as the recession keeps going on. And it's also interrupting schools. It interrupts people's livelihoods, their ability to make any money, and especially in the informal economy, poor people are hurt the most because there's no social safety net, there's no support for them, and there may not be markets for whatever they can grow in terms of food, and so that's been difficult. The pandemic highlights the urgency of all of this. The World Bank Group, what we've tried to do is in the initial phases, very quickly in April, we were able to put in 100 programs around the world in the poorer countries that allow the supplying of the basic healthcare needs. So, for example, personal protective equipment for medical workers was a critical step in what we were doing. And then over time, over the next year, we're going to be deploying a record amount of resources by the World Bank in order to counter the effects of the economic slump as well as the health emergency.
Well, let's turn to the topic of this program, and that is food insecurity. We've been trying to understand some of the root causes of it. In your view, is this about shortages of food? Is this because of supply chain disruptions? Is it because of a lack of income? Is it some other factors, all of the above? What do you think is really at the root cause of some of the food insecurity issues here?
Initially, we were very worried about there being shortages, but because there was a concern that some countries might stop their exports of food during the hardest first part of the crisis. that hasn't happened. But what has happened is the reduction in people's income. They just don't have enough money to buy the food. The prices have been relatively stable, but the incomes have gone down hugely. So that's been the biggest problem. The second problem is the supply chains have been disrupted. So it takes a lot of organization for people to move food from the fields to the processing to the cities. All of those systems are made more difficult by COVID, even in the poorest countries. And a third factor, some of the countries have had pretty severe currency depreciations, and that means that the price of food, whatever you're buying, the price of rice, the price of corn, the price of other staples has gone up in their local currency terms. So not only did they lose a job, lose their income, but the money that they did have doesn't go as far, and so that for people in many of the poorest countries, that means just not enough money. We've done some surveys, and when you ask people what's the biggest problem that they're facing, it has been the idea that they don't have the money to buy the food that's available in the stores or in their markets.
And in some regions, it's not just the COVID-19 pandemic that is threatening food security, it's locusts. Can you talk to us a little bit about the intersection of these two issues and how the pandemic and locusts are really creating this truly unique, unprecedented threat to food security?
This has several giant problems. One is they eat the food that's in the field, which the people are going to need. It also leaves people without the seeds they need to plant the next crop, and it also means that their livestock doesn't have the fodder, the food that the livestock needs. And in many ways, the livestock is what provides people with food and a livelihood for next year. And so we have this problem that starts as an immediate threat to the crops in the field, but then is spreading to what might become a very severe food crisis into 3 months from now, 6 months from now. So we're trying to help farmers have some access to food for their animals, to food for themselves, and then the seeds to plant another crop. That becomes a critical problem. And as I say, as you do, we're doing some real-time surveying in some of the countries, and it's very clear that people have this double problem of not enough income, the food supply disruption, and now the locust crisis on top of that. So it's very severe. We have done a regional support program in East Africa that's beginning to help with the controlling the locust and supplying some of the feed, but there's still not enough distribution systems for the amount of support that's actually needed.
So it sounds like there's both the immediate response and the immediate effects, but then the sort of second and third order effects that will also have to be addressed. I was hoping maybe we could talk a little bit about both the short term, what the bank is doing to respond to some of these food insecurity challenges, but also about the longer term. What is the bank going to be doing to support countries, whether it's technical assistance or funding over the long term, to help them build more resilient, stronger systems that will help them sort of bolster themselves against future shocks?
This is in many ways just as hard a part of the problem as the health emergency. It's because people, millions, in fact, hundreds of millions of people were living on the edge of extreme poverty prior to the pandemic. So as they fall into poverty, into extreme poverty, that means a lot of the progress being made begins to go backward in terms of nutrition, for example, in terms of education. So what we're trying to do is, number one, recognize this is an extreme crisis and therefore requires all of the bank's tools, and not just the World Bank. It's a combined international effort to provide enough support and the kinds of support that will help countries stabilize or deal with the health crisis, and then begin to set the stage for some kind of rebuilding on the other side. So some of the key things that are needed is in the very short term, the trade finance credits. So companies need to be able to borrow a little bit of money to import items in order to sell it and then pay off the financing. So that's an example where where money can quickly provide some kind of maintenance of the system. And the same on the export side. The company doesn't have the ability to buy the needed inputs in order to export unless they're able to borrow a small amount of money on the front end. And so IFC, the International Finance Corporation, is able to do that and maintain some of the supply lines for countries on their import-export side. The same kind of support, financial support, is needed internally in countries to maintain their private sector a little bit so that the markets can continue functioning. So that's one aspect of what the World Bank Group is doing. Then there's another part of this, which is the government's finances themselves. The revenues have gone down dramatically from their tax collection, from the types of activities that governments do to raise funding. That's become much harder to do. And so the bank can fill that gap for a while, but then the country also needs to be trying to do more in terms of transparency of those mechanisms. So we're working very closely with countries on ways that they can be clearer in terms of what their financial statements describe, and that makes them more financeable for the future. So one of the goals of this is to have individual developing countries that can be better off 2 years from now, 3 years from now, than they are now in terms of their transparency, their ability to raise funds, their ability to have the capacity to collect taxes, and with the ultimate goal, of course, is to provide much better public services for the people in terms of health, nutrition, education, infrastructure, all of the things that governments are needed to do. So we're working in many countries on new programs, expanded programs that will help with that effort. And I should be very clear, the basic building blocks for countries, and some of the hardest ones often are electricity that is on all the time, that doesn't brown out or go on and off, and clean water that's available for drinking by people so that they can have sanitation. Those become critical building blocks for the country's maintenance and then rebuilding.
Just getting those building blocks in place to support the recovery. David Malpass, thank you so much for being here this morning. We really appreciate your time. Well, let's start to unpack the complexity of the food security challenge and the intricate web of global food supply chains that keep food moving from farms to cupboards. Those supply chains, like so many other sectors, have been hit hard by the pandemic. Well, to understand just how they've been affected, there are few better people to speak to than Sunny Verghese. He is the co-founder and group CEO of Olam International, one of the world's biggest food and agribusiness companies. We recently spoke from the company's base in Singapore, and I started by asking him to tell me about the main challenges to his operations that COVID-19 has presented.
I see three basic kinds of disruptions across our value chain in the 66 odd countries that we are participating in. The first bucket is all the demand shocks. And demand shocks are pretty nuanced in terms of its impact on our business. So we have food products and raw materials and ingredients that we supply where demand is largely out of home consumption. And that demand has literally collapsed across most regions because of COVID restrictions and lockdowns. The second aspect of demand shock is that in some products, particularly the discretionary food products, what we call, for example, the noble nuts, the more premium, the high value
Slightly more
nuts or the
luxury
high
items.
value cocoa, the demand for those raw materials are also softened. But all food materials and ingredients that are centered to the plate and essential to daily lives, demand has actually grown. And there is the pantry restocking effect, both at the household level as well as at the retailer level, that is increasing the demand for basic food staples like wheat flour or rice or sugar. The bigger impact for us is in the supply side disruptions. So clearly, because of the lockdowns, there is a direct impact on production facilities not being able to operate at full capacity. We have, for example, 206 manufacturing facilities across these 66 countries. And in many cases, we are not able to operate at full capacity, although all the food that we produce is deemed in many of these jurisdictions to be part of essential products and services. And therefore, the governments have allowed us to continue to operate these factories. But we cannot operate at full capacity because of the availability of labor, the safe distancing and social distancing measures that we need to have in our factory. As a result, supply side disruptions in terms of production shortfalls is quite significant. We also have lack of labor availability, both on the farming operations in terms of the planting or the harvesting operations, and also the labor costs are going up. Largely on account of the fact that the health risk issues, labor and daily wage workers and seasonal workers are demanding higher wages to compensate for that health risk, but also because food prices for them are going up.
And Sunny, let's talk about those smallholder farmers. And by that, I mean the farmers that are usually supporting a single family through subsistence farming and maybe a few cash crops. How are they coping right now with reduced incomes? When you and your team are talking to them, do you get a sense that they're having to choose between buying seeds and buying food for themselves?
They have to make these daily choices of food versus continuing with their operations. And you can see that they are either skipping meals, or they are having lower calorie intake, or they're switching to lower nutritious food, and all of these impacts are there. They're also, the smallholder farmers, not getting adequate finance or even inputs to do the planting season that is underway on time. Because of currency devaluation, the local prices of these imported inputs in terms of fertilizers and agrochemicals are still quite high.
You know, another thing I've heard is that the disruption brought on by the pandemic has resulted in quite a lot of food waste. And what I mean by that is yes, unharvested or unsold food. Let's look to the future a little bit here. From your perspective, what are some of the opportunities you see to strengthen those food supply chains in a way that would reduce some of the food loss and waste that we're seeing?
In the COVID crisis, there is an additional loss that is happening as a result of farmers not being able to take produce to market because of logistics constraints, not being able to get sufficient or adequate labor as a result of lockdown and safe distancing protocols and measures. And that is compounding the inherent food loss that would otherwise occur in these supply chains. So I think a concerted collaborative effort to invest in storage and logistics infrastructure to prevent food loss is critical, because if you take the amount of food loss that we incur in our supply chains, it is equivalent to the whole of China's acreage under cultivation. And you can then extrapolate what it means in terms of carbon emissions and water use intensity and everything else.
Sunny Verghese, I'm really grateful for your time. This was a fantastic conversation. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Sunny Verghese is the co-founder and group CEO of Olam International, one of the largest food and agribusiness companies in the world. He joined World Bank Live from the company base in Singapore. Well, let's bring World Bank Group President David Malpass back onto the program and welcome a few other leading voices Joining us down the line from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, is Her Excellency Ambassador Josepha Sako, the African Union's Commissioner for Rural Economy and Agriculture. And from California, here in the United States, we have Henrietta Fore. She is the Executive Director of the United Nations Children's Fund, known around the world as UNICEF. Welcome to you all. And Ms. Fore, I just want to start the discussion with you and ask about the pandemic's impact on children. Can you give us a sense of what this pandemic has meant for children around the world?
Well, it's a great question. We think it's a hidden crisis for children. You know, often we're saying that this is not a pandemic that affects children, and yet children are affected in many ways. The Human Capital Index will show it. Children are out of school, children need access to health facilities, and children need good nutrition. And all of these make it into a real crisis for children. We're very worried that decades of progress will be rolled back, and probably our deepest worries are in the poorest countries, the poorest households in the poorest countries, and for girls.
And turning to the specific issue of food security as it relates to children, can you talk to us a little bit about how school closures are affecting children's nutrition?
Well, there are several ways. So one is that for many children, their only meal of the day comes at school. There's one other thing that we often see in schools, which is that teachers who are alert to what good nutrition means begin talking to their students about what it takes to be a healthy person. And many young women who are adolescents become mothers while they are still children themselves. So good nutrition needs to start early. It needs to be disseminated in schools. It helps when the teachers know about good nutrition so that those early years of a child's life are fed with nutritional parts so that their brains develop well and their bodies develop well. So there's much to learn about nutrition.
And can you help us understand a little bit how the lack of adequate food and nutrition for the youngest impact on the ability of not just the children to grow, but developing countries to grow, for them to thrive as a nation?
Well, that's a big leap, but it's a very important one. So with the World Bank, we have a number of programs with early childhood education and talking about the first 1,000 days of life. So if a child gets good nutrition, a good balanced diet in those first 1,000 days, they actually can develop a very healthy body and a healthy brain, which then means that they can learn in the future. And as they learn, every year that they are able to be in school and have good nutrition means that they can become more productive members of society. So there's an actual effect on GDP for a country if you give good nutrition to your youngest children. They're a very, very good investment. And sometimes governments have not really taken that in their budgets, but now is an excellent time to alert governments that giving good nutrition to the youngest members of their society will eliminate stunting and wasting and malnutrition and give them a healthier workforce that can thrive in the future and build their countries.
And Ambassador Sako, I want to come to you next. You know, Ms. Fore there is making clear that food security or the lack of it could have these long-lasting impacts on the economic growth of developing countries. Like I said, I want to come to you next, Madam Ambassador. We've heard, just now about how food, important food security is. Do you think that food and agriculture need to be prioritized as quote unquote essential services? And can you help me and the audience understand just what that means?
Of course, we know that food security, it's really the key for the African development. Food security and agriculture plays an important role for the social economic development on the continent. With this, we just had on the 16th of April, because today what we are doing at the African Union is the response to COVID. Due to COVID, we want to ensure that our population still have access to food. We we had the ministerial meeting on the 16th of April, and during this meeting, our minister came out very clearly that food security and nutrition in Africa, it's really a priority. We need to prioritize food security and nutrition on the continent.
And on that, I mean, you're really on the forefront of this response. I'm hoping you can help us understand the particular food security challenges that African countries are facing amid the pandemic. My understanding is that many countries on the continent rely heavily on food imports. In your view, what can be done to reduce the region's vulnerability to export bans or supply chain disruptions, food supply chain disruptions, to be clear?
Already before the pandemic, we are facing a lot of challenges in this sector. Our food system is very fragile on the continent. The food system is fragile on the continent. So in the last 3 years, we had 3 big shocks on the continent. We had in 2018, we had the fall armyworm that affected almost 50 countries on the continent. 50 countries on our continent were affected by the fall armyworm. And we had a lot of loss on our food security. And in 2029, we also had we had in the Horn of Africa, where we are here, we have the desert locust is still on. We hadn't finished even addressing the issue of the desert locust. And here we have with COVID-19. So all these 3 shocks are really affecting or disrupting the food security on the continent. All these 3 sectors.
A lot of shocks coming at you. One more question for you, Madam Ambassador, and then I'll go to President Malpass. I just want to turn very quickly, Ambassador Sako, to the African Free Trade Agreement, which I understand is coming into force on the 1st of July. Do you think that this will help meet some of the food security challenges, some of those food security needs? And if so, can you just briefly explain how?
We were supposed, it was supposed to enter into force on the 1st of July, but due to COVID, we extended it, we reported it to November. In November, we are going to have the meeting, the summit on CFTA, and it's going to enter into force. This instrument is very important. The lesson learned from the COVID is that because we are really dependent on importing our food on the continent, we have an import bill of 35 billion every year on importing foods. And if nothing is done, we are likely to have by 2050, $110 billion of import foods. Whereas this part of this continent has a lot of advantages in terms of agricultural production, producing food, because we have 60% of our land, which is arable land, so we can feed these 1.3 billion people we have, and we can feed the world. We can feed the world if we come out with a proper plan, a very good resilience, a strong resilience food system plan program for the continent. So we believe that the CFTA, it's the way forward for us also to trade amongst ours, to boost the inter-regional trade on the continent. This is very important because there are a lot of countries who are production surplus, and some countries are production deficit. So there is a need for us to really boost this intra-African trade. Another lesson we learned, we are dependent, most of our staple food in Africa, we depend on rice imports. Most of them goes to rice import, and also the wheat for the bread. And those two markets, due to COVID, the Asian markets, they have banned the exports of rice. And Russia, who is the first producer of cereals on the world, they also banned their own the wheat because they want to create their own reserve. So this is the time for us in Africa to also have our own food reserve. We have an initiative that we have already discussed with our minister last year during our CADEP-PP meeting, our annual meeting. We have an initiative which we call the Common African Agro Park, the Common Africa Agro Park. And this initiative will drive us to the industrialization, transformation, and modernization of agriculture on the continent. It is a very ambitious program, but this is the program that we want to implement under the mechanism of the CFTA.
Well, I just want to stay on the topic of trade and bring World Bank Group President David Malpass back into the discussion to get his view. And David, the ambassador there, she was talking about some of those export bans. My understanding is the World Bank Group has asked countries to avoid trade restrictions in light of the pandemic on food. Can you explain why that ask was made and why it's so important to avoid those trade restrictions?
By and large, many of those problems have been avoided. For example, Vietnam had put in a ban on the export of rice in April, but then they lifted that ban. So some of the remaining problems are the need for trade facilitation across country borders. Sometimes the bigger integration efforts are actually become obstacles. And so what I think will be most useful is if countries can find ways to trade across their borders. For example, one of the biggest blocked borders, a thick border in effect, is between Benin and Nigeria. Benin has rice production, but Nigeria has imposed a very, very high tariff on rice imports, and so it distorts the way the way farmers operate in those countries, and is very expensive. And so one of the things countries can do is across their borders find ways to allow people to trade. That will be one of the most helpful steps. I would also single out the borders in French West Africa. Those borders have tended to have obstacles, but it's also true in East Africa. The trucking routes are blocked by borders that are hard to get through, and that ends up costing each of the groups. And so one of the things we're trying to do is strongly encourage cross-border trade facilitation, so that because you get the best economic gains out of that.
And I just want to slightly shift gears away from trade for a moment, but stay with you, President Malpass. I wanted to ask you, because it really caught my ear when Ms. Faure was speaking about it earlier, the impact on children and the long-term consequences of this pandemic. Can you share some thoughts and maybe some details on how the World Bank Group is responding to the needs of children in the developing world as a result of the pandemic?
These are huge problems, because the losses if nutrition isn't strong, then the children have health problems. There's stunting, there's actual disease, and that those problems are going up because of the pandemic. Also, the systems for learning are much harder to do if children are out of school, or if they're trying to communicate, but there's not sufficient digital or internet, types of techniques to communicate. So we're working first. One aspect is to provide cash transfers to families so that they can have some maintenance, some sustenance as the crisis has deepened. And then another aspect is to build the learning systems that can be done from a distance. For example, in India, a critical thing is the education of the mothers for nutrition, for the need for vitamin A, for deworming activities, and other activities that are not so hard to do, but they have to be taught and they have to be practiced by people. Of course, hand washing during the pandemic is a critical step, and one that we promote actively with both advertising, with education programs. All of these are critical in terms of how societies can hold together during the pandemic and then begin to lay the basis for a stronger recovery.
And Ms. Ford, I just want to come back to you again and get your thoughts on the future and the actions that we can take to foster a more resilient, sustainable recovery from this pandemic. Can you talk to us about some of the actions that governments, businesses, even individual families could and should be taking to mitigate the blow of the crisis on some of the youngest generations, and in particular to protect those youngest generations' future?
Well, that's a big question, but let me try with a couple of thoughts that could be useful. One is that children should be in school and they should not be in the fields and at work. They should be having a chance at an education. Child labor is a real issue around the world, and as the economics of our world begin to get tougher and tougher for many of these families that are just on the edge of poverty or are deeply in poverty, it is difficult to send your children to school, but it is a very important message. And then following up on what Josefa was talking about on the need for local production, we're going to need more young farmers. Africa is a very young continent, but as you know, many young people want to go to the urban centers. They do not want to be rural and they don't want to be farmers, and yet there is a good livelihood in farming, and we need to be able to teach it with all the modern techniques. So education, what we teach in school, particularly in primary and secondary school, is going to be extremely important for the future. So if there were something that one could change coming out of COVID time, there would be two areas. One is picking up on what David Malpass was saying about education. Distance learning, remote learning could help children all over the world. One half of the world is not connected. Together, the World Bank and UNICEF are working on trying to connect every school and every learner to the internet. If we could, it would be a giant leap forward. It would be one of those great ladders out of poverty. And the second is water and sanitation. 40% of the world does not have water and a bar of soap. But at this moment in time, you need it in every school, in every building, and in every home. So if we could connect the world with water, it would help, and it would leave us stronger coming out of this time of COVID than when we entered.
And Ambassador Sacco, I just want to pick up on Ms. Ford's point about the need for young farmers there. What can be done to help African farmers and small businesses across the African continent both survive this current crisis, but also to grow and thrive in the future? And I'm wondering what role science and technology might play in some of those solutions.
We know that the productivity in Africa is very low, very, very low. So we need to improve on productivity. In order to improve on productivity, we need science and technology, the new technology. We need to leave the subsistence agriculture to a more modern agriculture. And that is where science plays a very, very key role. And our head of state during the Malabo Maputo Declaration, they decided to at least invest 1% of the budget on science, on research. Most of our research institutions are really going bankrupt. Even the platform we have, like FARA, on the research, they are all bankrupt because lack of investment in that area. And in agriculture, you cannot go to productivity or adaptation or resilience. You cannot have this program without associating science, science and technology into agriculture. So the new farmers, they really need to have this support. Before the liberalization of the economy, the ministries of agriculture, they used to have a unit or a department under the ministries, which is the rural extension. And the rural extension was providing the farmers with all this type of knowledge, But today we have the digitalization. So we need to really make sure that our farmers have access to all this innovation. But for that, we also need to really invest. I mean, we need to develop our rural area, bring infrastructure, bring internet, bring all this so that we can attract, agriculture can attract the young people to be involved, in agriculture. Because we have a challenge. The population is 1.3 billion on the continent. The demand for food is very high. So if we don't go through the science and technology, we are going to have a lot of problems. The other side, we have a lot of challenges on the climate change. We really need that the science and technology brings us, the seeds that are tolerant to droughts, and seeds that are also that are free from, tolerant to also to disease. All these type of, means that the farmers need it. And it's all through the research and the innovation. So if we don't really put the research and innovation into our agenda, we will not go anywhere, and our yield, our yield per hectare on the continent will continue to be where we are.
Sounds like science and technology are going to no doubt play a big role going forward. David Malpass, I just want to come back to you just to wrap things up, and I'm hoping you can leave us with a few of your thoughts and key takeaways in terms of how to build a better future for countries after this pandemic.
I'll try. We're in the midst of the crisis now, but one thing that's hopeful is as schools reopen, we've had some success in getting kids enrolled, and especially important is getting girls re-enrolled in schools, because so Henrietta mentioned the problem of child labor in the fields. If kids can be re-enrolled in schools, that's going to help. It also reduces the child marriage problem and the adolescent pregnancy problem that has been driving some portion of the rapid population growth. So also on the trade side, we can see that the techniques, digital is a fancy term, but it actually helps people find out what the weather is in the nearby counties or states or countries, and that helps them know what to grow in their own, the types of fertilizer, the types of seeds that will work. I think information can really help in this. So we're trying to support all of those programs. But for now, it's a deep crisis. It's going to go on some longer until there can really be a reopening of the global economy. I'm cautiously optimistic, looking forward to that process as the advanced countries can recover. That begins to reestablish the export markets for the developing countries. So those are some closing thoughts. Thanks very much.
I'm cautiously optimistic that'll give us some hope. I'm really grateful for all of y'all's time this morning. Thank you so much for being here. Her Excellency Ambassador Josepha Sako is the African Union's Commissioner for Rural Economy and Agriculture. She joined us from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Henrietta Fore is the Executive Director of the United Nations Children's Fund. And of course, David Malpass is the President of the World Bank Group based in Washington, D.C. Thank you to you all for taking the time this morning. Well, we've heard from our guests about efforts to handle the global food security challenge, but how is it really playing out at the country level? We asked a video crew to go to Nairobi, Kenya, where they met up with a farmer, an urban resident, and 2 government officials at a safe distance to fill us in.
The COVID-19 pandemic, locust invasion, and the ensuing economic downturn greatly threaten Kenya's food security. These multiple crises are disrupting the food supply chain, negatively affecting livelihoods and the ability of people to afford food, and driving up the cost of food, especially in urban centers.
Tarehe 21 ndio hii msika ilifika area hii, imeleta hasara mingi hapa. Imekuja imeharibu mahindi yenye watu walikuwa wamepanda, imeharibu kahawa, imeharibu nyanya ya wakulima, na tunaona imeleta hasara kubwa sana.
Locusts invaded 28 counties at a maximum, but the ones which were severely impacted were 12. But the interventions that were put in place with the FAO, with World Bank, and with Desert Locust Control Organization support, we were able to manage these infestations. And so far now, we have driven the locusts to 3 counties, mainly Marsabit, Samburu, and Turkana. But in terms of COVID-19, the biggest challenge has been, of course, disruption of access to markets and disruption of access to inputs, and also at the beginning, access to the farms themselves for workers, especially. Once the government started imposing restrictions, people were at a loss as what to do, so even farming activities were interrupted.
The crisis has disproportionately affected the poorest and the most vulnerable households in Kenya, which largely rely on farming and self-employment or informal jobs.
Every place nikienda kutafuta job, like kama mimi nimefanya kosi yangu ya hotel management, inanisumbua akili. Watu wanataka kupika food zao kwa nyumba, mimi nitaanzia wapi? Kila mtu anataka food ya hoteli. Sasa tunaambiwa social distancing. Kwa hoteli uwezi, lazima uongeleshe mtu karibu msikie nini anataka. Sasa ni kitu kingine imekuwa challenge sana. Ukirudi home, dada na job. Ukiangalia mama, busy yake sasa imeenda chini.
We have a huge population of urban poor in Kenya. And we are making cash transfers as opposed to just distributing food. And the reason for that is we want them to use the money, to use it within their local economies. The second category are people who are saying, I'm able-bodied, I can work. So we've started a program targeting the youth and women. It is called National Hygiene Program, or popularly known locally as Kazi Mtaani. So what is Kazi Mtaani? Kazi Mtaani is a program that is aimed at able-bodied individuals that we leverage labor-intensive activities for public good. And so we are upgrading the informal settlement infrastructure. And this is something that we are doing in partnership with the World Bank. And it is a program that has had a major impact. So we have got 32,000 young people now that are engaged in gainful employment. And it is able to put food on the table, but also we are able to do public good.
As soon as we realized that COVID would lead to lockdowns, which would disrupt agricultural activities and food processing activities, we moved swiftly to make sure that it doesn't turn into a food crisis for the country by forming a food security war room, which developed guidelines that ensured that movement of foods from farms to markets and movement of inputs from suppliers to farms was uninterrupted. And we also made sure that the whole government understood this, that food is an essential service and was treated as such.
The food security challenge has also presented an opportunity for the government to collaborate with the private sector and development partners to innovate through technology adoption in improving food security. Using digital technology, Kenyan companies are helping farmers optimize farm productivity. Firms are also providing timely and appropriate food transportation and warehousing. Digital technology is being employed to enhance access to a ready market for the food produced. Online delivery systems are also in place to put food on the table as Kenyans are social distancing during the pandemic.
There are so many new norms that have come up as a result of this Kenyan spirit. And that is what we need to nurture. And what it shows is that not only in times of need, but even in good times, we need to always remember that we are each other's keeper. And when we do that, this country can always be great, if not greater.
Well, let's turn our attention now to the experience of Bangladesh, specifically the city of Narayanganj, which is in the Dhaka region and is home to a large garment industry. It's from there that I recently spoke to Dr. Selina Hyatt Ivy. She is the mayor of Narayanganj, Bangladesh's first female mayor and a physician. And over the past few months, she has been working to guide her city through the COVID-19 crisis as her country faces high infection rates and severe income losses. I started by asking her to tell me how the coronavirus pandemic was affecting her city and how her government was responding.
You know, the Narayanganj is one of the commercial and industrial area in the Bangladesh. It's a very big city and is a very important city. The city is very badly affected because most of the garments is situated in the Narayanganj. A lot of the workers are working in here, not only garments and wholesale market as well as situated in the city. The city is badly affected. A lot of people are suffering from the COVID-19. And what we are doing, we are trying to support to the people. I mean, awareness activities and all kind of support. I mean, we have a medical team, 3 medical team. We are working over the telephone. We have an ambulance service. We have a sample collection technician, and in Narayanganj already government declared one hospital as a COVID hospital, and as well as other things also we are doing. But people at this moment, people are not listening. They are not very aware. So what is a lot of people are now affected. Most of the people are not affected. At first it was in the ward or zoning. Now is everywhere. I mean, house to house transmitted.
Can you talk to me a little bit about how this is impacting the poorest residents in your city?
Yes, poor people are suffering. A lot of suffering poor people, and they have a food crisis. But you know, the government of the Bangladesh, central government and also Prime Minister office, they provide us food supplementary. Food stuff like rice, flour, lint, as well as we providing to the poor people, middle class people, under the supervision of our councillor and also our municipality staff supervision, and then other things, not only government, businessmen also helping us.
Well, Dr. Ivy, let's talk about food supply. You mentioned it there about trying to get some of the food to some of the poorest residents. Can you talk a little bit about the situation when it comes to the food supply in your city and in your country? Are the supermarkets open? Are people able to buy the food that they need for themselves and their family?
At this moment, supervisor is open. But if I tell you about 3 months ago, that time everything was closed. And there was a problem to buy the food or something like that. Transport was closed. Not like a lockdown, but like a lockdown. People is everywhere, everything is locked down that time. So that time government provide us food item and other things. So municipality also provide to the people what they need. Sometimes people call us, they need the food, they need the medicine, they need the ambulance and also medical team as well as. But nowadays everything is open, so people can buy. But poor people can't buy because they have no money, they have no work. Still now garments is open, but not all garments are open. So people are working little bit. But at this moment, everything is open, but risk is that so many people are now affected, and they are suffering severe. They are suffering from the COVID, and a lot of people is suffering.
Dr. Selina Hyatt-Ivy, thank you so much for joining us today. I know you have a lot of demands on your schedule, so I'm really grateful for you taking the time, and good luck to you and your team and the people of Narragansett City. Really appreciate it. Well, let's zoom out and get a more global view now. The World Bank has offices in 120 countries across the globe, and through the hard work of staff in those and at our headquarters in Washington, D.C., we've now launched COVID response projects in over 100 nations around the world. To help us get the view from South Asia, West Africa, Latin America, and points far and in between, I'm really happy to be joined right now by a panel of World Bank country directors. Marianne Fay is a country director for a number of South American countries and joins us from Lima, Peru. Junaid Ahmad is the India country director and is coming to us down the line from New Delhi. And last but certainly not least is Soukaina Khan, country director for several West African countries. She joins us from Bamako, Mali. A welcome to you all. Well, let's start by just getting an idea of how the pandemic is affecting the food security that for countries that each of you is responsible for. Junaid, I want to come to you first. And I'll start by just asking, India's population, it's huge, it's dense, and there's, extremely high poverty levels in some places. That must present an extraordinary challenge for the country's pandemic response. I've read that the government there has imposed the largest lockdown in history. Can you tell us how that's impacted on the ability of people to get the food they need during this crisis?
Yes, you're absolutely right. This is the world's largest lockdown in the COVID crisis. It's imposed by the federal government, the central government, and the state governments have all responded accordingly. But what has been very important is the strategy that government undertook. It is a threefold strategy. One is they intervened on the health side, and the health side has led to the social distancing and the lockdown and a purposeful slowing down of the economy. Very, very different than past global shocks where you actually immediately entered with a fiscal stimulus. Here you're actually slowing down the economy because you're imposing social distancing and lockdown. And as a result of that, they have introduced a major social assistance program, a nationwide federal program to really support the vulnerable and the poor, almost 50% of the population, and bridge them during this lockdown. And in that context, they have a major food distribution system, huge reserves of food, a public distribution system that is quite incredible. And they've unleashed that public distribution system to support communities and citizens across the country. And the last element of the COVID response has been economic stabilization. So just as they protected the poor and the vulnerable during this lockdown, they're also protecting the economic assets, if you will, and in particular the small and medium enterprise. So there's an economic stabilization program. But coming back to your question on the food, it's really on the public distribution system that they've ensured that everyone gets access to food in the short term, because it is an incredible distribution system.
Soukaina, as I said at the top, you're in Mali. That's part of the Sahel region, which I'm sure is facing, its own unique challenges in light of this pandemic. Can you help me and those watching on this program understand some of the factors that are making responding to the crisis particularly difficult in your region?
Thank you very much for the question. Sahel is already prone to food shortage, drought, and for the past decade, insecurity. And if we look at the latest estimate by the West African Regional Organization named SEALS in terms of food insecurity, in March, around 6.5 million people were declared food insecure. And among those 6.5 million, 500,000 is in emergency need. So what the COVID has only exacerbated this situation. And we estimate that this will double due to COVID-19.
The acute food insecurity could double due to COVID-19. Marianne, I just want to round out this little trip around the world and come to you for your view next. I've seen in some of the headlines and heard firsthand from friends and family in the region that Latin America and South America have really suffered from this pandemic. Indeed, I've seen reports that it's really looking like, an epicenter of the crisis at the moment. What has that meant in terms of the food supply chain in the region that you live in?
Well, look, COVID-19 and the measures to control it have impacted virtually every aspect of the agri-food value chain, from input supplies and production to harvesting, transport, marketing, cash flow, and liquidity. We've had a lot of borders and movement restrictions and lockdowns, which have meant that a lot of on-farm labor hasn't been able to get to work. One of the concerns is whether this will affect future availability of food. But in the short run, we've had instances of localized and intra-regional supply chain breakdowns linked to transport interruptions, as well as discarding, as we've seen in other countries, of perishable products. But one thing I really wanted to note is the key source of risk that we're seeing in the period ahead is reduced access to food due to impact on livelihoods and the sharp reductions in income of the poor and the vulnerable. All these social distancing measures that most countries have adopted have resulted in massive job losses. We recently did a phone survey in Bolivia, and this shows that this has translated into increased risk for food insecurity. So just to give you some of the numbers, 70% of surveyed households reported a decrease in household income, and 17 reported not being able to come back to their job. And as a result, 43% stated that they had run out of food at some point in the past 30 days because of a lack of resources. 43%. 31% said they had an adult that needed to skip a meal. So, we are immediately already seeing all of this, despite all the measures that are being put in place to try to help.
I want to turn now, let's talk a little bit about that short-term response. We sort of laid out the conditions in these different regions. I want to get y'all's views on how these food security challenges are being addressed and how to best protect people now in the short term during this crisis response moment. Soukaina, you told us about the challenges in the Sahel region. You mentioned how food security, even before the pandemic, was an issue there. Can you talk to us a little bit about what is being done to get help to people most in need now?
Thank you. First thing is about protecting lives. And we were able to mobilize a quick disbursement mechanism to help the government address the immediate food security needs. In Chad, we use our existing project and use what the so-called CIRC component to mobilize $30 million immediately within weeks. We did the same in Mali, and we're doing the same in Burkina and Niger. This allowed not only working close collaboration with partners like FAO or WFP to not only help farmers with seeds, but provide immediate food needed by almost 2 million individuals and for 450 farmers in Burkina Faso.
And I just want to stay with you, Soukaina, for a minute more. For those of us who aren't as familiar with West Africa and the countries there, can you talk to me a little bit about how regional cooperation is factoring into the immediate crisis response?
It helps at several levels. First, in terms of the crisis, as I said, we have a West African regional organization called the SILS. This is the organization that monitors the food security situation in the countries, given how the borders are really fluid in the West African. So the assessment that we had from March 2020 was based on that West African regional. We are supporting as well ECOWAS in terms of policies, but as well how we could have a package of immediate response. And we're working with individual countries as well in terms of more tailored a solution for farmers, for individuals, cash transfer, food transfer, but as well in terms of policy reform to prevent and address this food security situation.
And Marianne, across your region, across South America, in terms of the food supply, you mentioned earlier, what are some of the critical needs of people and the needs that the governments are facing, and how are they being addressed in the immediate term?
Look, what is critical is that the response be rapid, because it's an immediate need, properly targeted, and customized to the context in order to be effective. And that has not been easy. We have different needs across the region or across even individual countries between rural and urban areas. And we also have country-specific challenges. So, for example, we're moving into hurricane season in the Caribbean right now, and that needs to be factored into the overall response. But look, in terms of general response, in Latin America, just like in the rest of the World Bank has contributed to all these efforts by restructuring existing projects and preparing emergency interventions. And these have been of several types. A number have been on the health side to try to assist with, providing supplies and ventilators and so on and so forth. But others have been, for example, in the agricultural sector to try to help farmers working in key value chain continue to plant now. The approach we've used in the Latin America region at the World Bank is to make sure we protect lives, we protect jobs, but we also protect the future, right? So trying to really make sure that we're not also sacrificing next year's crops. Now, a number of countries have put in place social transfers, immediate cash transfers to be available to a wide range of the vulnerable population. The challenge with these is that a lot of the people who weren't necessarily poor before have now fallen into vulnerability and need these. And the countries don't typically have very sophisticated social registries in which they can identify these people. So in the end, in countries like Bolivia and Peru, it's been sort of a blanket rollout. In Bolivia, 98% of households are eligible for these transfers. In Peru, it's 87%. But this said, they're eligible, which is not necessarily that they will get this. They need to find ways of accessing this money, and that has been a challenge.
And you talked about there, Marianne, about preparing for the future too. And I want to come to that in a few minutes and talk about preparing for a more resilient future. But Junaid, haven't forgotten about you. I want to get the view from India. And one thing that has stuck with me, we were talking last week about the situation in India, you and I, and you seem to have a lot to say about the social inequalities. I'm wondering if you could briefly share some of those thoughts here. And on that topic, can you talk us through the social response programs? I'm thinking cash transfers and even things like self-help groups that are playing a big role in helping the poorest feed their families in your region.
The COVID pandemic crisis has revealed many things to us. One thing it has revealed, and you're hearing from my colleagues, that if countries have existing systems that work, then they can be resilient to shocks. So India has quite a vast set of social protection programs. On one hand, they have an incredible food distribution system, 800 million people linked to that food distribution system. Second, they have Jan Dhan, people's accounts, bank accounts, over 300 million, and half of them to women, where cash can be transferred directly to their accounts. Third is in the rural areas, a job creation program. When the economy is down, government actually guarantees a job. So there's a whole public works program that exists. Then you have a series of frontline workers. To me, the real heroes of this COVID crisis, they're Anganwadi workers, they're health workers, they're workers in local government that have been able to go house to house. Then you have a program which is gas cylinders. Now you say gas cylinders, you see a lot of the cooking is done with wood and poor sources of fuel that creates air pollution inside the house, a lot of health problems. And who bears that health? It's the gender bias is very clear. It's women who are bearing the incidence of that. So providing gas cylinders and, in effect, clean fuel has been very important. All of these programs of social assistance, government has, in fact, increased during the next 3 months. And we put in $1 billion into government social assistance program to really leverage all of these programs. But even as these existing structures are strong, COVID also reveals the fault lines in society. And the fault lines that you see in India are in the urban sector. We're talking about the migrant worker, we're talking about the informal worker. They don't have the rural social protection system that really, I think, is protecting the rural sector. So informal worker, the urban migrant doesn't have that kind of protection. And it's that group that has really suffered quite a bit, both from the lockdown, because small and medium enterprises have been hurt, and that's where their jobs are. and government has had to come up with new programs to support them. And part of our social assistance is to create a new urban social assistance program, which I think, along with the existing rural program, will provide a global pan-India social assistance program. This has been one of the big shifts, if you will, in the way government has approached supporting and protecting communities. One final point I want to stress: all my colleagues are talking about saving lives, and that's exactly right. And the paradigm that was put on the table was lives versus livelihoods, i.e., you protect lives, you slow down the economy, and yes, jobs are lost. But when you have so many countries with people at a vulnerable and poor category, it soon becomes lives versus lives, not lives versus livelihoods. And that's why you're seeing around the world, especially in part of South Asia and Africa, a movement towards unlocking the economy, to come back even though the virus may not have been defeated. And I think that this unlocking itself is going to cause new problems and new challenges that we're going to have to take a look at.
Mm-hmm. We're getting a bit short on time, so this next section, very important, but we'll have to answer the questions very briefly. Marianne, earlier you spoke about the need to prepare for the future. We've now talked about some of the immediate needs and areas of concern. Let's look out further over the horizon and talk some solutions and what we can do to sort of build back in a way that's a bit more resistant to the next crisis, to future shocks. So Marianne, I want to come to you next. I know a lot of the focus is on the immediate needs, the health, the immediate social support. But as you think about the future, do you see opportunities to put longer-term programs in place to make agriculture more secure and resilient, as well as opportunities maybe to strengthen those food supply chains against a future shock?
Yes, I think there's three angles we can take when we think about that. One is the thing that we've done recently, which is to look at various scenarios for food systems in the coming decade. And we produced a report called Latin America Future Foodscape, Reimagining Agriculture in Latin America and the Caribbean. Now, what this did was to identify options to encourage the emergence of more productive, efficient, inclusive, climate smart, resilient agricultural food system in Latin America. So we identify about 20 actions, a mix of policy reforms, institutional reforms, and investments. Now, some of these are guaranteed to pay off no matter what. For example, making, working investments to make agri-food system climate smart, strengthening defenses against food-borne diseases. Those we know will pay off no matter what. But others are more designed to try to result in a more vibrant and inclusive and prosperous system, right, for agriculture. So, for example, that would be the development of biofortified foods, what we call nutraceutical, the use of these agricultural products or forest products for medical purposes, or also things like declaring war on junk food. This is a region that has an enormous problem with obesity, and one of the reasons then that is affecting the country's ability to resist to COVID. And then the other point I wanted to make is, as we step back from the crisis, we also need to think about the important fight against racism and the need for social justice and inclusion across Latin America. These are countries that should have made a lot of progress in reducing poverty, but not so much in reducing inequality. And rural populations have very little impact very little access to services, and that is impacting their ability to join the modern economy and prosper.
Mm-hmm. Sukaina, I want to come back to you. Looking at the Sahel, building a more resilient food system would probably involve tackling issues like conflict and climate change over the longer term. I'm curious, are you optimistic about the plans that are being put in place to tackle these issues across the Sahel region?
Look, in addition to saving life and livelihoods, we are focusing as well with the government on saving the future, like my colleagues have mentioned. And despite the challenges, we are optimistic about the holistic response that we're trying with the government to provide. One is in terms of policy reform, really are helping them. And if you look at the recent emergency DPO for Mali, have identified with the government some specific measures to improve their preparedness. One issue that we're always working on with government is about targeting. The real problem for our social safety programs, they were geared towards rural area. And now that we need to extend to urban, we really need to work closely with the government and totally repurpose some of the safety net database. We're working as well at the regional level, which is very important, whether it's through the pastoralism, which is a great source of conflict for in Sahel, but an opportunity as well if we scale up our existing project of pastoralism. We have as well another regional project to increase food resilience. And we're working as well on how we can make agriculture in each of those countries more climate smart agriculture and working with IDP. So it's a multi-dimensional problem that we're trying to address through different angles. At the end, our main really our main constraint is about the conflict. When we have active conflict in certain areas that are already food insecure, our ability to intervene is limited. And that's why the partnership, and that will be my last point, is critical. Our partnership with WFP, with FAO, to help us reach those areas where the government has no presence is critical in what we're trying to do. It's very challenging, but as well, I think we have some opportunities to make changes on the short term and longer term.
Lots of challenges, but lots of opportunities. Junaid, just as we wrap up here, I understand that India is really thinking about how to better support the agriculture and food sector over the longer term, especially when it comes to those smaller farmers, the smaller enterprises. What are some of the ideas that are being discussed? What can you tell us about those?
There's several ideas that are being discussed. One is completely to open up the marketing system for food. Right now, from the past, where food security was the main name of the game, farmers were asked to come into government-owned markets to sell there, to get a fair price, and also for food security, this is where public distribution would kick in. I think we've moved completely to an era where now you need much more market-oriented systems. So we're beginning to see the opening up of direct relationship between the farmers and the markets. That's, I think, one. Second is water management is a very, very big issue. India is seeing a complete depletion of its groundwater. It is a country that has yet to figure out how to value water. And because it takes a view that water is a public good and hence needs to be handed free, you see that water guzzling crops are being promoted. And now under the COVID, it's become very clear that is not any longer sustainable. And you're seeing a lot of changes in that. Third area that you're beginning to see is subsidies or distorting subsidies, especially in fertilizer, are being re-questioned. But I have to say that I think we would be mistaken that if we take the COVID crisis as it occurs today and think about technocratic issues or solutions for the future, I think COVID is forcing a rethink of the relation between the state and the citizen. It's forcing a rethink about policies in different sectors. And unless we are part of that conversation and we can support that conversation, all the technocratic solutions that we can put on the table is not really going to have an impact. Reimagining the state, its relation with citizens and its market is going to be a long-term impact of COVID. And how we engage in that, even as we put in money behind social protection or health or economic stabilization, how we enable the conversation between countries and leadership in reimagining the state, I think we are going to see the impact of COVID last far longer than we would want to.
Yeah, as you said, COVID causing people to really rethink some very big ideas about government and business. I just wish we could keep talking about all of this for several more hours. This is all fascinating. I just want to thank each of you for taking the time to be here on World Bank Live today. Sukaina Khan is the World Bank Country Director in West Africa, based in Bamako, Mali, where she joined us. Down the line from Lima, Peru, we had Marianne Fay, World Bank Country Director for several South American countries in the Southern Andes. And from New Delhi, we've been talking to Junaid Ahmad, the World Bank's India Director. A big thanks to all of them for being here.
Thank you.
Well, for the past few days, our social media team here at the World Bank has been soliciting your questions for this program, and we've been delighted by the response. Joining me now to answer some of these questions and offer some thoughts on everything we've talked about today is Jürgen Vogele, the World Bank's Vice President for Sustainable Development and an old friend of World Bank Live. Jürgen, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
All right, well, to get us started, we received two kind of similar questions from @Katra Ude and Tijani Ibn Aluyu, and they wanted to know about the future of food. Specifically, they're curious about your thoughts on technology and innovation on the farm and whether young entrepreneurs will be driving the digitalization of agriculture.
Great question. I mean, we do need to transform the global food system. This was true before COVID, and it is true even more as we are in the middle of this crisis. We need to have a highly productive agriculture. We need to have a nutrition smart and sensitive agriculture, and we need an agriculture with a much lower environmental and particularly climate footprint. In order to do that, there is a lot of opportunity out there right now in terms of new technologies. Of course, digital connectivity is a very big one, but there is also a lot of data and information technology out there that can be put to use. David Malpass actually mentioned some of this in his earlier conversation with Henrietta and the commissioner from the Africa Union. This will be absolutely critical to get young people excited to go back into farming that are not going right now. This was also a conversation in the context of the African situation. So I think there is massive opportunity right now out there to have a much more sustainable agriculture and a broader food system using the technologies that are out there. Just for you to know, you may not know, there is about 1,000 startups at the moment around the world.
Wow.
Trying to innovate as we speak, all aspects of the food system. So this will evolve very rapidly.
And you mentioned there the previous panel. If anyone wants to watch any of that back, it'll be on live.worldbank.org later on. But next up, Jürgen, we received a very straightforward question from Tarachand Vishnoi, who asked, isn't there enough food for everyone? Why is this a problem?
Well, we are lucky at the moment. Globally, the food supply is in good shape. This is different from where we were 10, 12 years ago when we had the last food price crisis, where there really were low stocks. There was a lot of issues in countries with the production cycle. This time is different. The last harvest was very good. Stocks are at a historical high. And so the total food amount is not the issue. The issue is that there are supply chain disruptions in countries and that people have lost income, particularly the poorer parts of the population. And so they don't have access to food and they can't afford it. So there's a very different situation from what we had before. Overall, we have enough food to eat. But the problem is a significant part of the population right now doesn't have access to it. That is particularly true for migrant workers, and it's particularly true for the informal sector and for, of course, the poorest part of the population.
The food's there, it's just getting it to people. The next one is from Kennedy Shiundu, who asked, what is the bank doing to encourage improved nutrition education and awareness?
So again, we've had this conversation a little bit in the panel earlier between Henrietta Fore and the World Bank president, Malpass. So we're doing a number of things to make sure that education takes place in the local areas, that people understand what it takes to have a healthy, nutritious diet. And then, of course, we are trying to really support agricultural research to make sure that we have more nutrition dense and more nutrition content in the food that we produce. Right now, it is very important not just to look at quantity of food, it is the quality of food. We live in a world today where half the world's population, literally every second person on the planet, is malnourished one way or another, either too little food, the wrong food, or too much food. All of these are nutritional challenges. And at a time of crisis like this, of course, this comes out. Right? And so we are making sure that all the agriculture and food systems interventions that we finance have a nutrition lens and a nutrition angle. And this, as I said, this includes education, go to schools, tell the teachers how to educate the children and the parents. But it also means investing in a better diversity of the cropping system and in higher nutritional density seeds going into the ground. So there's a broad range. It's certainly a major focus in the bank at this point.
And one more audience question for you. This one's from Kimuyu Patriki, and they asked whether the locust swarms in East Africa and some parts of Asia and the Middle East are likely to cause food shortages.
Look, this is, of course, a great question. Unfortunately, those areas, the Horn of Africa, East Africa, Yemen, even parts of South Asia, are facing this double whammy right now. Not only do they have to deal with COVID, the supply chain disruptions, on top of that, they're being attacked by the worst locust plague in 70 years. And the situation is really, really difficult in some areas, not everywhere, but in some areas, it's extremely difficult. The fodder is eaten for the animals. The food is eaten, the seeds are gone. So it's an extremely difficult situation. Again, President Malpass did mention this in his intervention. We are putting together a $500 million support program for these countries over the next 18 months to, first of all, put cash into people's pockets who have lost their livelihood and their income, but then secondly, also support them with seeds and the materials going forward. So yeah, you're absolutely right. To the person who asked the question, this is terrifying for those people at the moment. And we as an international community need to do everything we can to help them deal with this crisis.
Yeah, and Jürgen, I'm really grateful to everyone who wrote in to share their comments and questions for us this morning. I had a few of my own that I wanted to ask you, and the one that really stands out to me is from all that we've heard today, there does seem to be, and trying to find some silver linings here, there does seem to be a real opportunity, even as tragic as all this is, COVID-19, the locusts, the various other crises that are happening around the world. There's an opportunity here, I think, to take lessons from these crises and do things better in the future. What are some of those standout opportunities that you see kind of as you survey the state of the world right now?
As you say, Paul, every crisis must be an opportunity. We cannot not learn from this and prepare for the next crisis, which is sure to come, right? So one of the things, and we've discussed it a little bit earlier, is this whole notion that technological solutions can help us if we apply them, thoroughly in the futures to avoid some of the issues. But of course, there is more than tech fixes. There has to be also real thoughtful interaction as we come out of this crisis between society and government. What is the best way for government to prevent these things, to build resilience into a society, and also to be ready when a pandemic like this hits, or any other crisis for that matter? I think Junaid in the conversation among the country directors sort of made that point, saying, this shows the fault lines in our societies, that when crises hit, we are not ready for it, and that there are certain parts of the population that get served well because we've anticipated the problem, but other parts of the society, such as the migrant workers or such as poor people in slum areas and cities, we are not prepared to support them, and we need to anticipate and do that. So it's technology, but it's also the way we look at the way government uses its resources and it interacts with society that needs to be looked at. So one very important one is agricultural subsidies. Right now, the governments around the world are spending about $500 billion per year to give money to farmers for certain things. But that money could also be used and given to prevent crises and to be prepared for them, and when the time comes, that we are ready for it. So these are some of the thoughts that are going on right now. The same is the One Health element of this. The fact that we now increasingly realize that zoonotic diseases are coming at us at about a rate of one every 5 years. In the last 20 years, we've had 4 of them. We were just lucky that not all of them were as bad as the one we have right now. This will continue. And unless we really begin to take One Health seriously, which looks at the way we treat livestock, we interact with our ecosystem, our environment, and the way we do our health systems. So these are all opportunities that I see where there is hesitation. It never makes it to the top of priority list in many conversations with governments, but now is a moment of reckoning and to say, going forward, we need to take this more seriously.
And our colleagues recently released their global economic prospects. That 2 of these come out a year. The most recent one was just here in the past, I think, 2 weeks. And one of the forecasts in it was for a global downturn of over 5%. And that's a downturn of 5% in global growth. I can imagine this will shrink per capita incomes, which are already low in many of these developing regions. How do those facts affect plans to build back and try to build back more sustainably and resiliently?
Well, it makes it even more urgent, right? And even more important to build back better. I mean, we've never had such a fall in per capita incomes in my lifetime or in any of our lifetimes. So this is extremely significant and hurtful. It will throw people back into poverty in very large numbers. We're estimating it could be 100 million or more. So and governments, certainly poor countries, don't have the resources to build back better if they are not very focused on what needs to be done. So bringing back productive activity is a very important part of that building back better. And the food system broadly, not only agriculture, but all the trade, the logistics, the value chains, in many, certainly in the developing countries, is a huge part of your employment. 60%, 70% in the poorest countries are involved in one way or another in the food system. So rebuilding this and supporting that is a very important aspect of building back better.
And I know we're short on time, but I did have just one more question I wanted to put to you. For the audience watching today, of everything they've heard, is there one point or story or message that really stands out to you that you really hope that they'll take away from this program?
Well, maybe it is this conversation that we also heard from the Kenyan minister, as well as from our country director in India. It is, we got to be here for each other, right? And we're not taking this seriously enough in our conversation between government and civil society. So I think now is a moment to really understand these fault lines, to really understand what can we do to prevent this from happening again. And I think we know what needs to be done. It is a question of political willpower, plus some financial and technical support that organizations like the World Bank and others are providing to get us into that space. That came home to me strongly today in that conversation.
Well, Jürgen, thank you so much for taking the time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Paul.
Jürgen Vogele is the World Bank's Vice President for Sustainable Development. He joined us from his home in Washington, D.C. Well, that's it for this inaugural episode of our new Resilient Recovery series here on World Bank Live. We'll be back in the coming days, weeks, months with more bright minds sharing their ideas on how to build back for a more resilient and sustainable future after COVID-19. A huge thanks to everyone who joined us here on World Bank Live today. David Malpass, Ambassador Josefa Sacco, Henrietta Ford, Dr. Selina Hyatt-Ivey, Sunny Verghese, Marianne Fay, Junaid Ahmad, Sukaina Khan, and Jürgen Vogele. If you joined us late and you want to watch any of this back, you'll be able to find it soon on live.worldbank.org. I'm Paul Blake. You can find me on Twitter using @PaulandBlake. From me and everyone here on the team, thank you so much for tuning in, for sending your questions, your comments. Stay safe. We'll see you again next time.